Yes, thank you for having me here with this topic. I must confess that when I contributed the abstract for Nicholas, I was a bit surprised that there is no panel on music. So I thought, how could I smuggle in, as a musicologist, talking about music? And in this time, I started to be very much interested in the DVD media generation of formats we have now. So I'm trying to combine music analysis and looking at the DVDs, but I won't. I've learned a lot through your paper, and now I won't go into a real media reflection at this time. In 1913, at the climax of Wagnerism in Europe and North America, Wagner's Ring was performed in many opera houses, large and small. Despite the relatively large number of performances and the presence of Wagner's works in this area, it was probably beyond the imagination of most Wagnerian enthusiasts at the time that 100 years later, with the help of a technical medium, it would be possible to see a dozen different Ring productions without having to travel all across Europe or to New York. In fact, even at the beginning of the 21st century, we may marvel at least a little bit, though video is so naturally part of our everyday media landscape, that the dimension of the staging of Wagner's music dramas has become so directly available. Available not just through Amazon and at libraries, but rather in many cases individual scenes or entire acts as directed by Patrice Chéreau, Harry Kupfer, Otto Schenk and Tiziano Mancini, are literally just a mouse click away from each other for free on YouTube, uploaded by aficionados for aficionados. And the encounter with Wagner's works happens through video today, you could say. I'm not sure whether you also notice how difficult it is if you do a Wagner seminar to keep the video dimension out of the discussion. It's on the contrary, especially for newcomers, it's easier to sneak into a scene from the Chéreau production than to grab and open a piano score. Wagner today does not come as a libretto or a score, but in an audiovisual format. I think musicology should actively use and shape this situation. The growing media archive of video productions at the beginning of the 20th century, in parallel with the archive of audio recordings from the 20th century, increasingly makes it possible for text-oriented analysis to think and to proceed in exchange with the text actualizations on the media. Analysis is always interdependent, as has already been pointed out for instrumental music by Hans-Joachim Hinrichsen, Nicholas Cook, and others, with practical interpretation history, even if this relationship is made explicit only rarely. Interpretation analysis cannot do without analytical knowledge, especially formal knowledge. By the same token, analysis that emanate from the score also cannot be envisaged without a certain image of sound which in turn has been built up through performances or recordings that one has played, experienced, or listened to. But particularly the latter relationship is extremely difficult to grasp. Text analysis almost always suggests that it is independent of concrete realization. A radical change in media, like the path of video productions of operas and music dramas in the past 2 decades, behind which lies the even greater stylistic change to the so-called Regietheater over the course of approximately 4 decades, suggests, however, that shifts have taken place and are continuing to take place. But where do they become apparent, and how can they be addressed? Let's assume a relatively simple example of the mutual impact between text analysis and interpretation analysis. 2 German colleagues, Heinz von Lösch and Fabian Brinkmann, recently showed how clearly and unchangingly the tempi in a Beethoven sonata correspond over decades to the basic formal structure of the sonata form on which it is based. The formal scheme acquired analytically serves as a background for the results of the tempo measurement. Do you have a pointer here? Or is this also a pointer? No. Okay. You see the formal categories: Exposition, Hauptsatz, Überleitung, Seitensatz, and you can correspond or correlate the tempo measurements of about 50 recordings of the Appassionata with the form. The example of instrumental music shows how the field becomes more complex when applied to the relationship between an opera score and the staging of or video recording thereof. It becomes difficult primarily due to two factors. The semiotic and media layers are multiplied through the layers of language, scene, and camera work. And musical dramatic form in Wagner's music can in no way be grasped as ambiguously as in the sonata form. To the contrary, the question about the secret of the form of Wagner's music drama is among the central myths of musicological Wagner research. For this paper, I selected a scene that stands out specifically in that a musical dramatic form is not easy to describe. Until just a few years ago, the Wotan monologue of the second act of the Valkyrie remained one of the scenes in the Ring for which the charge of formlessness was asserted, one of the oldest topoi and anti-Wagnerian criticism. The analysis discussion in the 20th century veered from the extreme of Alfred Lorentz's decidedly apologetic theory of form to a fundamental rejection of just this dogmatics by Karl Dahlhaus' generation of scholars, and has found a certain balance in successful attempts to describe the middle structural level of a scene as a dynamic and individualized form like Anthony Newcomb, Bill Kinderman, and Thomas Gray and others did. From this back and forth discussion, which in retrospective was a very productive one, the long monologue from the Valkyrie first seems to emerge as a kind of loser. Already for Wagner's contemporaries, the recitative mode that dominates this scene made it seem undramatic in its monologic, epic structure, and was reason enough to make the entire passage one of the first candidates for extensive proposed cuts. Wagner himself was quite aware of the problematic nature of this part when composing it. In 1855, he wrote to Liszt, "In sober, disheartened hours, I'm most afraid of Wotan's great scene, namely of his fateful revelation to Brünnhilde. Indeed, in London, I once went so far as to want to scrap the whole scene completely." As we know, he did not, but emphasized in the same breath, for the course, quote, "for the course of the entire large four-part drama, it is the most important scene." May this has become a common view, the skepticism towards the musical form coherency of the monologue remained. One of the first rehabilitators of the scene was Anthony Newcomb, who in 1981 still kept the view that the tonal organization of the scene was not only unclear, but, quote, "hopelessly various and confusing." However, he made clear that the formal characteristics of the scene are by no means a technical deficit, but a compositional choice. The scene is, quote, "a conscious and bold formal experiment." Tellingly, Carolyn Abate did not take up this positive formulation, but rather with her extensive study, once again critically rejected Dahlhaus' negative assessment and thus became a second rehabilitator of the scene. She solved the problem of the reduced and toned down leitmotif level Dahlhaus had described, and the scene's recitative mode by means of a new analytical hermeneutic approach. To hear the entire monologue of Wotan's direct voice, as a conversation with himself not directed to the public. If you listen for leitmotifs in the traditional manner, you misconstrue the scene. The orchestra melody can be consistently understood as an impression of this intimate, authentic perspective of Wotan's, which is why the usual distancing communicative function of leitmotifs is partially suspended. According to Abate, the monologue thus acquires, particularly in its first half, the character of a ballad or a song. Formally fundamental for this character is a principle of similarities and repetitions developed at several levels. This includes many similar cadences and ends of sections, and particularly an almost strophic development in 3 narrative cycles in which the arioso character increases more and more. Abate's analytical observations have proven to be inspiring, but did not propose any overriding formal concept. Such a concept was conceived, based in turn on Abate's analysis, by Tobias Jans in his analysis of the sound dramaturgy of the Ring. He offered a solution that, in a convincing way, links the important formal stations and comprehends the relationship between narration and affect as a large, developing, recurring structure. To this end, Jans placed the focus on the passage at the beginning of the scene, which Wagner in his direction comments termed as an increasing expression until the most dreadful outburst, der Ausbruch, O heilige Schmach. That's, I'm using here the sonic visualization just to have an overview of the whole scene. So what Jans pointed out is this beginning outburst as a kind of model. It exposes a certain group of leitmotifs and returns, these are the gray blocks, 3 times as a kind of reprises. And what he also described is that on the text level, I don't know whether you can see this, these are the smaller arches which are green, blue, and then orange. Oh, thank you. Does this work? Yes, these ones here. And this is a model where past tense, present tense, and future is always repeated 3 times. Here it's a little bit more complicated, but it ends with the future tense, and the future tense is sometimes expressed in subjunctive or as an imperative. With this solution, with this analytical disclosure of this latent 3-part form structure of the scene, this represents, I think, a successful understanding of the design of an entire scene. Since Jans' study, there is no longer any question of an amorphous, unstructured form of the Wotan monologue. Such analytical results arguably need no stage action to be observed. They represent structural features of the score. But with the realization for the stage, the conductor and the director may emphasize or highlight, attenuate or overwrite such layers of the score, or quite often may add new layers that have not been seen or heard before. And this may change or inspire formal analysis again. The secret of the form in Giraud's realization as we have it on the DVD, so I'm kind of taking the DVD as we have it now. I can't go back to the performances. I have not seen them myself. Of the scene, his secret of the form is not only his virtuosic and extremely precise Personenregie, but also can be found in an independent visual level of movement that interlocks the monologue dramaturgically with the previous scene and decisively structures it in terms of form. I'm talking about the large pendulum in the middle of the room, that brilliant, ambiguous stage prop that became one of the icons of this production. Rotating in a large radius, it dominates the stage in the first scene, in the argument between Wotan and Fricka. With non-stop movement similar to a clock or a pulse, Giraud gains a means of dramaturgic marking, in fact, at the moment when this clock stops or is stopped. At the climax of the showdown between Wotan and Fricka, when Wotan's defeat is decisive, the pendulum attenuates within a short time. It remains still during the entire beginning of the Wotan monologue and only begins to swing again when Wotan, with his words "Ein anderes ist's, wes mich die Waller gewarnt," penetrates to the core of his entanglement. This point formally corresponds exactly to the first shift from past to present Jans observed. The rotation of the pendulum increases again and accompanies the first and second reprise of the outburst and is abruptly stopped with a large symbolic gesture by Wotan at the words, "Nur eines will ich noch, das Ende." Let's see whether we can jump into
der Wahl.
In this way, this moment is marked as the center of the monologue. The three-part structure outlined by Jans now attains a clear climax at the end of the second arch. So we are in a way adding a more three-part, two arches of tension here with this visualization and staging. Through a stage prop which acts in time, structuring and accentuating, the scene gets a two-part contour that is manifested as a process of heading towards this ending cadence and the section after this point. In 1988, Harikupfer built on Giraud's great arc of suspense, but with other theatrical means. He gets along with an empty stage completely without such time-based props, structured solely by using the choreographed movement of the persons, and highlights the moment of the ending cadence through an effect which outdoes Giraud's solution.
Für das Ende sorgt Aldrich. Jetzt versteh ich den stummen Sinn des wilden Wortes der Wahrheit.
We could enter into a detailed comparison here, but the time does not allow it. I will just only mention two aspects. First of all, behind the switch from Giraud to Kupfer, one can see the varying Wotan concept of the two productions, like in a snapshot. On the one hand, Giraud's brutal, calculating man of power, who actively reaches to the pendulum and thus stops his world's clockwork. On the other hand, Kupfer's human-like God, who becomes a victim of a deus ex machina stage magic that staggers him and Brünnhilde no less than it staggers the audience. Secondly, the increase in the means is also structurally relevant. While Giraud leaves the score's grand pause after Das Ende untouched, his strong gesture is mute and on the visual level only. Kupfer, if you like, intervenes in the score. The monumental sound of the collapsing stage floor forces its way into the notated silence and in turn motivates the following actions as a sign effective for the persons on stage. Giraud's and Kupfer's prominent markers shape the overall dramaturgy of the scene. They teach us to interpret Wotan's cry, das Ende, outcry, das Ende, as the peripeteia of the scene and therefore of the second act. At the same time, the gaze of Regietheater can lead to a new analytical observation. A defining characteristic of the compositional design of the first part is its continuous anticipation of elements of the Ende cadence. In this listening perspective, the decisive bars, nur eines will ich noch, das Ende, arise virtually from the sum of their partial anticipations, embodied by a great number of cadences and phrase endings that in one or the other way show similarities with the big Ende cadence. So there are compositional features that support Giraud's and Kupfer's arch of suspense and a musical dramaturgy that steers towards the decisive moment, like to a vanishing point of Wotan's thinking. I can't go into detail, but one anticipation moment is this, where he says, riet mir ab von dem Wahlerring, riet mir ab von dem Ring, warnte vor ewigem Ende. There this big cadence is already prospected. And let me conclude. Anyone who has seen and heard on video the staged embodiments of Giraud, Kupfer, Schenk, Villa Morabito, or others also analyzes the musical level differently. It is a sign of a fruitful relationship between music analysis and staging that it can be inspired and encouraged by the varied solution made accessible by DVD releases. The case of the Wotan monologue raises the question of whether it continues to make sense to conduct musical analysis of Wagner's works completely without any reference to the history of how they were directed. The idea that form in Wagner's music can be considered abstracted from the development of stage direction increasingly proves to be an artificial separation between score-bound constants and variables of scenic visualization, particularly when the realizations in media achieve a status similar to text, the repetition which is possible now, enabling comparative analysis. The diverging perspectives and ways of embodiment in production history are ever more an obligatory part of the interpretative framework of a musical drama. It becomes less and less possible to detach musical formal analysis from this memory of production history and its interpretive potential. Thank you.
We have time for a few quick questions. Thank you, Christian, for a very interesting paper. And if I could just make you pause for a second until the microphone comes to you, maybe Olaf.
Thank you very much for this interesting paper. What I was thinking of, like, if this, what you point out, is a chance to get rid of this fatal word of the work. In German, we call it the Werkbegriff, and it's really like a political theme for all the conventional audience who expect to see the repetition of what they saw like 40 years ago, and think that this is the work, and like say, okay, please do it as it is written in the work. But as you point out, that we no more receive the works by Wagner through the score, or the first approach is not through the score or through the music itself, but through YouTube links or whatever. Do you think that this brings up newly on the real idea of a work, that it has to be perceived as a work of the total theater, so that stage and music are combined together, and you cannot separate them from each other?
I would think the media history moment is a chance for it, but as we just heard, there are so many limitations with this media formats, so that by engaging into a detailed analysis, comparing score aspects with the video production, we are also losing something. It's a bit this being engaged into the direct listening and the evaluating analytical listening. But I think I would see it's more on the side of gaining something new. And for me, it's more and more, I don't look into the score only. I look at 1, 2, 3, 4 productions, and then I'm inspired to see new things in the score. But the whole method, or the way you have to work, is much more complicated. If you just open the score, you know.
Anno, and then Ben.
Thank you very much for a very interesting analysis, and I completely get your point, looking at musical form and then kind of looking at the production side of it. But I was wondering, where is the layer of media within that analysis? Because as I kind of understood the whole approach, this seemed to have kind of the third layer, really. But you, at the end of the paper, you didn't really come back to that. So, because I think the fact that we are seeing what we're seeing, and how the video or the media representation is dealing with the production, which of course is a huge screen, not a small screen, is a very has to be considered finally. And there, I would think the connection between DVD and form, so to speak. So to get the first layer and the third layer would be very interesting to consider more than it is, because of what you said at the beginning, because of course, especially the young generation is perceiving this especially through YouTube.
It would actually be the next part of this paper, to look at the different camera perspectives and the cuts. For example, this moment in Kupfer's production, it can't be conveyed without having the totale, and then there is kind of rhythm established through the shots. I haven't put this layer on top of it, but I must say that I talked to some video producers and also to sound engineers at the Bayerischen Rundfunk, and most of them said, and also Brian Large once said something in this direction, that you try to cover the performance, and you try also to limit your instruments to be as near to the performance as you can. But I know that this difference exists, but I can't travel back to 1976 or 1981. This is my Giraud, and I have to live and to analyze with it.
So but it's not Giraud. Who directed the camera? is what we're saying. Because that's actually the agency I'm interested in, so we should stop talking about it as Charot, but as that person's layer of interpretation.
Okay, we can add Brian Larch in this note, and we can add 2 other video cutters here. But nevertheless, this is information and a memory about a production that existed. And I would even say some things I observed here with this pendulum, they must be much more intense if you have the totale of the stage all the time, where you see this pendulum. Here, you lose it many times because you have the shot on the persons. So of course it's a middle, but if you compare it to opera film or staged TV operas, you see what a distance there is again with the media format that influences the piece.
Just one more comment, very briefly. That's why I mentioned the Lepage production. It's not so innocent, of course. The mediatization of what we see. But maybe soon, maybe there's something like the screen, like the iPhone or the iPad version of it, where you have the full screen, and then you go yourself and decide what you want to see while you have the whole thing in front of you all the time. Does it exist already? I don't know.
Or think of Johanna Dombois. She says actually this format of filming or staging on a normal stage and then making a TV production out of it is totally out of date. We have to transform the whole thing into a digital performance. So of course we are advancing at this.
Ben, you had your hand up, so maybe we'll do Ben, and then we'll pause and go on to the next one and see if we can come back at the end and talk more.
Thinking a little bit about this, maybe about this idea of the work concept and the text that Wagner was able to produce in 1876, materially. And certain things he was able to notate and control with great precision. One of those being the time, the rhythmic and so forth of the music. And especially with a music drama of this sort or any sort, where the music is continuous, that structures and regulates the time aspect of the performance quite precisely. So I was very interested in this scene that you showed us. In both of the productions, and I'm sure this is common in many productions, the moment of greatest directorial freedom occurs at the moment of the fermata.
Yeah, that's true.
And that's where both of the interesting, the stopping of the pendulum or the opening of the floor happened.
Yeah.
And is that just a meaningless coincidence, or do you think that points to something significant?
No. Definitely, this is a space where the director can get into the piece, and I didn't present it here, but I did comparisons between the 4. Of course, this is more the recording level, but it's the sound from the DVD, so not from the CD. And you see here that Levine has the proportions of the tempi are quite similar. Sometimes he needs much more time at the beginning, where he kind of loses time. It's written here like they start at the same point and who's the first. Yeah, but the first is Charot definitely, and it's 26 minutes with Levine, and he uses in the Otto Schenk production there is no special effect in the Regietheater manner, of course, but he just uses time and the Stille, just the pause. So, and then this moment is also stretched. But from the visual and the stage action, it's extremely, unmarked. Thank you for the hint. Yeah.
Yes. And maybe we'll end on that, and we'll move on to our next paper. Thank you very much, Christian. That was a wonderful paper.
Thank you.